The dust was a living thing in the summer of 1882. It had a color, a deep and angry red that clung to everything in San Miguel County. It coated the splintered rails of the corral fences, settled in a fine grit on the brim of a man's hat, and worked its way into the throat, making every breath a dry protest. The sun beat down on the Arizona territory with a merciless, white-hot fury, bleaching the grass to the color of old bone and baking the earth into a puzzle of deep, thirsty cracks. For Eli McKenna, the dust was the taste of failure. He stood on the porch of the ranch house his father had built, a solid structure of timber that now seemed to shrink under the vast, empty sky. At 35, Eli moved with the quiet economy of a man who conserves his energy because he has little to spare. His face was weathered leather, his eyes the pale blue of a sky that promised no rain. He rolled his left shoulder, a habitual motion to ease the ache from the old bullet wound hidden beneath his shirt, a permanent reminder of a dispute 5 years past that had cost another man his life and Eli a piece of his soul. Sleep did not come easy. It hadn't for a long time. The nights were filled with ghosts, sudden noises in the dark that would jolt him awake, heart hammering against his ribs, the scent of gunpowder phantom in his nostrils. He'd rise and walk the length of the porch, watching the moon hang indifferent over his dying land. The 3M ranch, his inheritance and his burden, was choking on the dust. The cattle told the story better than any ledger. Their ribs showed like wicker baskets beneath their hides, and they moved with a slow, tragic listlessness. They would stand for hours at the North Spring, whose once reliable flow had dwindled to a muddy trickle, their dark eyes full of a dumb, pleading patience. Eli knew that patience wouldn't last. Neither would his. Phineas Dodd, the president of the Red Mesa Bank, had made that clear. Dodd was a man whose smile never reached his eyes, a man who dressed in Eastern suits that seemed to repel the red dust by sheer force of his will. 30 days, he had said, his voice smooth as a polished stone. 30 days to make a payment, or the bank would begin foreclosure proceedings. The words had hung in the air of Dodd's office, as cold and heavy as a winter fog. 30 days. In a land without water, it might as well have been 30 minutes. That evening, a Saturday, Eli rode into Red Mesa. The town was a straight line of defiance drawn in the dirt. At one end stood the stark white church of Reverend Silas Pike, its steeple a finger pointing toward a heaven that seemed to have forgotten them. Pike was a severe man, his sermons filled with fire and warnings of divine judgment for the sins of the town. At the opposite end of the street, as if in direct answer, was the Mesquite Row Saloon, its bat-wing doors swinging open and shut, spilling yellow light and the tinny music of a banjo onto the dusty street. Eli needed a drink. He needed the burn of corn whiskey to scour the taste of dust and despair from his throat. He tethered his horse and pushed through the doors of the Mesquite Rows, stepping into a wall of noise, heat and the smell of stale beer, sweat and cheap perfume. The place was crowded. Ranch hands and townsfolk alike were packed shoulder to shoulder, their voices loud and rough with Saturday night release. Eli found a space at the bar and ordered a whiskey. He drank the first one fast, feeling the welcome fire spread through his chest. He was nursing the second when a sudden hush fell over the room, a collective turning of heads toward a makeshift stage at the far end of the saloon. Jasper Crow stood there, a man who moved with the lazy confidence of a predator. He was Phineas Dodd's right-hand man, the one who did the banker's dirty work with a grin. A half-dozen of his cronies stood with him, their faces flushed with drink and mischief. "Gather around. Gentlemen, gather around," Crow called out, his voice booming over the last murmurs of conversation. "Tonight, for a good cause, the Mesquite Rose is proud to host a charity event to benefit our thirsty souls." A wave of laughter rippled through the crowd. "We're going to hold an auction," Crow continued, holding up a piece of paper. for the honor of a dance and a signature on a genuine marriage contract with our own San Miguel County beauty." He gestured to the back room, and two of his men emerged, leading a young woman between them. She was tall and slender, with a cascade of dark hair and eyes the color of a stormy sky. She moved with a stiff, unnatural grace, her hands clenched at her sides. A low murmur went through the room, a mix of pity and cruel amusement. It was Mara Quinn. She lived in the boarding house at the edge of town and worked odd jobs, a silent figure folks mostly ignored. They said she hadn't spoken a word in years, not since her family had passed through on their way west and met with some tragedy she alone had survived. Eli felt a sour taste rise in his throat. This was low, even for Crow. "Now, she's a little shy," Crow said with a smirk. "A silent bride, you might say, but the contract is just for fun, a souvenir of the evening. All proceeds go to the fund for community improvement." He winked, and the men around him roared. He was holding a real marriage license. Eli saw with a jolt. It bore the official seal of the county. The prank was uglier than he had first thought. He saw the woman, Mara, flinch as the bidding began. Men shouted out numbers, laughing and shoving each other, their bids rising in a tide of drunken bravado. She stood on the stage, a statue of misery, her gaze fixed on the floorboards. Eli saw her landlady, a hard-faced woman named Mrs. Gable, standing near the back, counting the coins being tossed into a bucket. She had pushed the girl into this. Eli turned back to his drink, trying to shut it out. It was none of his business. He had his own problems, bigger problems than a cruel joke in a saloon. But the jeers and the laughter grated on him. He saw Mara's shoulders tremble, a tiny, almost imperceptible motion. The bidding stalled. Crow looked out over the crowd, his eyes scanning the room. "Come now, gentlemen. A beautiful bride, a legal document to hang on your wall, a story to tell your grandchildren. Who will be the lucky groom?" His gaze landed on Eli. A slow, malicious smile spread across Jasper Crow's face. "Well now, look who's hiding in the corner. The Lord of the 3M himself, Eli McKenna, a man in need of a wife to warm his lonely bed, I'd wager." The crowd turned as one, their eyes on Eli. He felt a hot flush of anger creep up his neck. "I'm not interested." "Crow," he said, his voice low and flat. "Oh, but you must be." Crow pressed, walking toward him. "A man of your standing. Surely you can spare a few dollars for a good cause. It's all in fun. What are you afraid of?" The challenge hung in the thick air. Eli looked past Crow, at the woman on the stage. Her head was up now, and her gray eyes met his across the room. There was no plea in them, only a profound and weary stillness, the look of someone who had endured so much that one more indignity was simply a feather added to a mountain of weight. He didn't know why he did it. Maybe it was the whiskey. Maybe it was the sight of Dodd's man trying to make a fool of him. Maybe it was the quiet defiance he saw in a silent woman's eyes. "Fine," Eli said, the word tasting like ash. He threw a handful of coins on the bar. "That cover it." Crow's eyes widened in triumph. "We have a winner, the Honorable Eli McKenna." A path cleared for him as he walked to the stage. The crowd was cheering, stomping their feet, standing before her. He saw that Mara was taller than he'd thought. Her hands, clasped before her, were trembling. Judge Caffrey materialized from the crowd, his robes askew, his face a blotchy red. He was the county judge, but everyone knew his rulings were for sale to the highest bidder, and tonight he was clearly sold to the bottle. He swayed on his feet, holding the marriage license. "Do you, Eli McKenna?" the judge slurred, squinting at the paper. "Take this woman." "Just sign it, McKenna," Crow urged, clapping him on the back. "It's for a laugh." Eli looked at the pen being offered to him. This had gone too far. It was a stupid, pointless cruelty. He was about to refuse, to turn and walk out of this whole sorry mess. When Mara moved, she pulled a small, worn piece of paper and a stub of pencil from a pocket in her dress. Her fingers flew, her script quick and desperate. She pushed the paper into his hand. He looked down. 4 words were scrawled there. If you sign, they stop. He looked up from the note, into her eyes. Then he looked out at the sea of leering, laughing faces, at Jasper Crow's triumphant sneer. He looked back at Mara's trembling hand. In that moment, the fate of his ranch, the 30-day notice, the sleepless nights, it all faded. All that existed was the profound shame of the moment and a sudden, inexplicable urge to end it for her. He took the pen and signed his name. His signature was a hard, angry slash of ink. Judge Caffrey fumbled with a heavy brass seal, pressing it onto the document with a loud, definitive thud. The saloon exploded. Men were howling with laughter, pounding on tables, slapping each other on the back. They had their joke. The rich rancher, brought low, hitched to the town mute. It was the best show they'd had in months. Through the haze of whiskey and the roar of the crowd, a cold clarity began to seep into Eli's mind. The thud of that seal echoed in his ears. It hadn't been the light tap of a prop. It had been the solid, official stamp of the law. He looked at the document in the judge's hand, at the embossed seal gleaming in the lamplight. It was real. The whole thing was real. The laughter of the crowd suddenly sounded different. It was no longer the sound of a shared joke. It was the sound of a cage door slamming shut. He was married, legally, bindingly married to a woman he did not know, a woman who could not speak. As the crowd began to thin, Eli stood frozen, the enormity of his foolish act crashing down on him. Mara was gone from the stage, spirited away by her landlady. Jasper Crow gave him a final, mocking salute before disappearing into the night. Eli stumbled outside, gasping for the night air, which was still thick with dust. Across the street, standing in the shadows just outside the circle of light from the church, stood Reverend Pike. The minister was watching him, a thin, knowing smile on his lips. A marriage born of mockery is an affront to the Almighty. Mr. McKenna. Pike's voice drifted across the street, sharp and cold. God is not mocked. Further down, near the bank, another figure detached himself from the shadows. Phineas Dodd adjusted his tie, his face a placid mask. But Eli saw the glint in his eyes, the quick, sharp look of a man whose calculations had just paid off handsomely. Dodd was thinking. Eli knew with a sickening certainty about the territorial laws, about the Homestead Protection Acts that gave certain legal advantages to a married man. Protections that could be complicated, twisted, and ultimately broken by a clever banker who held all the cards. The joke was over. The trap had been sprung, and Eli McKenna, owner of the failing 3M ranch, was caught fast. The ride back to the 3M was a long study in silence. Eli rode a few paces ahead, the set of his shoulders as rigid as the parched landscape around them. He could feel her presence behind him more than he could hear it, a small, steady weight on the old mare he had borrowed from the livery. He had paid Mrs. Gable the pittance the woman demanded for Mara's belongings, which filled a single, small carpet bag now tied to her saddle. He had not looked at Mara, not since that moment in the saloon when the finality of his action had settled on him like a shroud. He had created a legal bond with a ghost, a woman whose name he barely knew and whose voice he had never heard. They arrived as the sun was bleeding its last orange and purple across the western horizon. 2 figures were waiting on the porch, drawn by the sound of the horses. The first was Hank Torres, his foreman, a man whose face was a roadmap of 70 hard years, his skin wrinkled and tough as old boot leather. The second was Noah Finch, a boy of 17 with a shock of sandy hair and the eager, uncertain energy of a pup not yet fully grown. Hank's eyes moved from Eli to the woman on the mare, and his jaw, which was usually working on a piece of tobacco, went still. Noah just stared, his mouth slightly agape. Eli dismounted, his movement stiff. "This is Mara Quinn," he said, the words feeling foreign and heavy in his mouth. "She'll be staying here." He did not add the word wife. He could not. Hank's gaze was sharp, missing nothing. He looked at the single bag, at the woman's plain dress, at the way she slid from the horse without waiting for help, her movements fluid and contained. He looked back at Eli's grim face. He was too wise to ask the questions that were screaming in the silence. He simply nodded. "Ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his hat. Noah, recovering himself, rushed forward to take the mare's reins. "Welcome to the three, ma'am," he stammered, his face turning a shade of red that clashed with the sunset. Mara met their gazes, one after the other. She gave a small, formal nod to each of them. Then she reached into her bag and retrieved a small, smooth piece of slate, no bigger than her hand, and a nub of chalk. She wrote a single word and held it up for them to see. "Hello." The house was as tired as the land. It smelled of dust and bachelor living, a faint, stale odor of old coffee and fried bacon. The kitchen was the heart of the neglect. A stack of tins of beans stood on the counter, next to a half-empty bag of hardened flour. The wood stove was coated in a layer of grease, and a fine film of red dust covered every surface. Eli showed her to the small spare room at the back of the house. It was little more than a closet with a cot. "This will have to do," he said, his voice rough. He turned to leave her there, to retreat into his own misery. But she touched his arm. He flinched, surprised by the contact. She held up her slate. "Thank you." He just grunted and walked away, retreating to the porch to watch the last of the light die. He heard Hank and Noah in the bunkhouse, their voices low and questioning. He was the talk of his own ranch, a fool who had gone to town for a drink and come back with a silent wife. When he finally went back inside, the air in the house had changed. A clean scent of soap and water was chasing away the stale smell. In the kitchen, the grease was gone from the stove. The dusty counter was wiped clean. A pot of coffee was simmering, its rich aroma a welcome ghost from a more prosperous time. Mara was there, moving with a quiet efficiency that was almost hypnotic. She had found a crate of potatoes in the pantry that Eli had forgotten about and was peeling them with a small paring knife. She glanced at him as he entered, her expression unreadable, then gestured with her head toward the stove. He poured a cup of coffee. It was strong and hot, the best he'd tasted in years. He sat at the kitchen table while she worked, watching her. She did not waste a single motion. She found an onion, some salted pork, and soon the smell of frying potatoes filled the room. She laid out 2 plates, 2 forks, and 2 mugs. They ate in silence. The food was simple, but it was the first real meal he had eaten in the house in months. Later, he heard her moving about. He saw her take the blankets from Noah's bunk in the main room, where the boy had been sleeping off a fever from working too long in the sun. She carried them outside and shook them hard, sending clouds of dust into the moonlight, then hung them over the porch rail to air out in the cool night. She was not a guest. She was a presence, a quiet force already setting his neglected world into a new and unfamiliar order. The first night was the worst. He lay on his bed, the whiskey worn off, leaving behind the raw, throbbing headache of his folly. Every creak of the old house, every sigh of the wind outside, was a fresh torment. He thought of Dodd's 30-day deadline. He thought of Pike's smug, condemning smile. He had not just made a fool of himself. He had handed his enemies a new weapon to use against him. The marriage, this absurd, ridiculous marriage, would be seen by the law as a change in his status. Dodd would use it somehow. He would twist the homestead protection law, designed to help families, into a noose. A marriage performed as a public joke would have no standing. Dodd would argue it was a fraud. He would use Pike's moral outrage as leverage, painting Eli as an unstable, godless man unfit to manage his own affairs. The banker's plan became terrifyingly clear in the darkness. And Pike, the Reverend, wanted more than just moral superiority. Eli had never trusted him. Pike's eyes were too hungry. Men said the Reverend had a keen eye for good land, that he had advised others on where to file claims. He coveted the north pasture of the 3M, the very land where the spring was failing. Perhaps Pike knew something about the water table that Eli did not. Perhaps he believed the spring was not dying, but merely hiding, and he wanted it for himself, for the church, for his own power. The thoughts churned, a bitter stew of regret and rising panic. He must have drifted into a shallow, restless sleep. He was dreaming of the gunfight, the flash of powder, the heavy kick of the pistol in his hand, the coppery scent of blood. He was jolted awake by a loud bang. His heart seized, and he sat bolt upright, his hand flying to the empty space on the nightstand where he used to keep his Colt. It was just the wind, rattling a loose shutter on the window. His breath was coming in ragged gasps. A cold sweat slicked his skin. The ghosts were close tonight. The door to his room creaked open. A silhouette stood in the doorway, black against the faint moonlight from the hall. He tensed. Every muscle coiled. It was Mara. She moved into the room, not with fear, but with a calm deliberation. He stayed frozen, watching her. She stopped beside his bed. He could see her face now in the gloom, her expression one of solemn concern. Slowly, as if approaching a spooked horse, she lifted her hand. He thought she might touch his face, and he recoiled from the idea of it, the intimacy. But she did not. Her hand went to his left shoulder, her fingers settling with an impossible lightness directly over the old, puckered scar. Her touch was not pitying. It was just there. A simple, warm, human connection. A silent acknowledgement of the wound he carried, both inside and out. The panic in his chest did not vanish, but it subsided. The frantic hammering of his heart slowed to a steady, heavy beat. He did not pull away. He sat there, in the dark, with this strange woman's hand on his shoulder, and felt the ghosts retreat. He lay back down, and she did not move her hand. He closed his eyes, expecting the familiar torment to resume. Instead, for the first time in 5 years, sleep took him, a deep, dreamless sleep that lasted until the first gray light of dawn. The news of the joke marriage spread through Red Mesa like a brush fire. It was the main topic of conversation at the general store, the blacksmith's shop, and especially at the Ladies' Aid Society meeting at Reverend Pike's church. The women, their faces tight with disapproval, spoke in hushed, scandalized tones. To be married in a saloon, as a drunken spectacle, and to that silent Quinn girl, of all people, it was a disgrace. When Mara rode into town with Noah a few days later for supplies, the women turned their backs on her, creating a wall of righteous silence. A group of children, emboldened by their parents' gossip, were less subtle. They followed her down the street, chanting in a sing-song voice, "Silent bride, silent bride. Got no tongue to run and hide." Noah's face flushed with anger. "You little heathens, get away from her," he growled. But Mara stopped him with a hand on his arm. She turned to face the children. Their taunts faltered under her direct, calm gaze. She smiled, a small, sad, and beautiful thing. Then she raised her hand. She touched her thumb to her fingers, then opened her palm flat. She did it again. It was a simple, graceful gesture. A little girl at the front of the group, her braids bouncing, tilted her head. "What's that?" she asked, her curiosity overriding her cruelty. Mara pointed to the girl, then repeated the gesture, and then pointed to herself. Then she went to the store's dusty window and wrote a word in the grime with her finger. "Hello." The children stared, fascinated. The little girl shyly imitated the hand sign. Mara beamed at her and nodded. The other children, their pack mentality broken, began to practice the new game, their mocking forgotten. replaced by a sudden, intense interest in the silent woman and her secret language. They rode home with the supplies, the silence in the wagon comfortable now, but the peace was short-lived. As they approached the turnoff to the ranch, a rider was waiting for them. It was one of Dodd's clerks from the bank. He handed Eli a folded, official-looking document without a word and spurred his horse back toward town. Eli unfolded it. The legal language was dense, but the meaning was brutally clear. It was a formal notice from the San Miguel County Bank, pursuant to the terms of his loan, and in light of his recent change in marital status, a full and complete inventory of all ranch assets, specifically livestock, was required. The inspection would take place in 29 days. Failure to demonstrate sufficient assets to secure the loan would result in immediate foreclosure. The pressure had begun. Phineas Dodd had started the clock. The bank's notice was a death sentence with a deadline. There was no water, and now, no time. The only chance, as thin as a wisp of cloud in the vast blue emptiness, was Dry Fork Canyon. It was a long, hard push north, a place of sharp rocks and deep shadows where, in years past, a man could sometimes find a seep, a trickle of water coaxed from the stone. It was a gamble, a desperate march to move the weakest of the herd to a place that might kill them just as easily as the drought. The morning Eli, Hank, and Noah prepared to leave. A new routine had already taken hold at the 3M. Mara was up before any of them, the scent of strong coffee and frying salt pork already filling the kitchen. She moved in their space with a quiet purpose that left no room for awkwardness. She packed their saddlebags with jerky and hard biscuits, her hands working with a deftness that suggested she had done this many times before. She did not hover or offer unwanted advice. She simply saw what was needed and did it. As Eli cinched his saddle, he watched her. She was in the corral, talking to Hank, or rather, Hank was talking, and she was listening, her attention absolute. He was gesturing toward Juniper, the old, sway-backed mare, explaining the worn spot on the saddle that needed attention. Mara nodded, running her hand over the cracked leather, her touch analytical. She was not just a presence in his house. She was becoming part of the ranch's worn and fraying fabric. He saw her glance at the ledger on the porch, the book where his father had meticulously recorded every birth, every death, every dollar spent. He had not opened it in a year. The night before, he had seen her sitting at the kitchen table, the book open under the lamplight, her finger tracing the lines of his father's fading ink, a small frown of concentration on her face. The 3 men rode out, pushing the 50 weakest head of cattle before them. The dust rose in a choking cloud, a constant companion that turned the world to a hazy red. They moved slowly, the cattle lowing in protest, their hooves stirring the parched earth. Back at the ranch, a different kind of survival took root. Mara worked with a tireless, focused energy. She took the cracked saddle leather into the cool shade of the barn and spent hours stitching it with an awl and waxed thread. Her work small, tight, and stronger than the original. She cooked for herself, simple meals that used what little was available. And every evening, she sat with the ledger, the chalk and slate beside her, making her own careful notes on the dwindling supplies of flour, beans, and salted meat. Hank had seen the look in her eyes before he left. It was the look of someone who understood that survival in this land was not a grand gesture, but 1,000 small, relentless tasks. The day before the cattle drive, he had taken a light carbine down from the rack in the barn. It was smaller than the rifles the men carried, with less of a kick. Every soul on a place like this needs to know which end the bullet comes out of. "Ma'am," he had said, his voice gentle. She had taken the rifle, its weight familiar in her hands. He showed her how to load it, how to work the lever action, how to sight down the long barrel. They walked to the far end of the pasture, where he set up an old tin can on a fence post. Her first shot went wide, kicking up a puff of dust a foot to the left. She did not flinch from the noise or the recoil. She calmly levered in another round, took a deep breath, and fired again. This time, the can jumped. A small, satisfied smile touched her lips. For the rest of the afternoon, she practiced, her movements becoming smoother, more certain. It was not the practice of a hunter, but of a woman determined to be a fortress, not a victim. Up in Dry Fork Canyon, the work was brutal. The trickle of water was barely enough to sustain the herd. The men took turns, day and night, clearing rocks to pool the precious liquid, making sure each animal got its share. The sun beat down into the canyon, the heat reflecting off the stone walls until the air shimmered. On the third day, Noah found the first dead calf. It lay near the small, secondary stream that fed into the main seep, its legs stiff, a white foam crusted around its mouth. An hour later, Hank found 2 more, hidden in a thicket of scrub brush. By evening, they had found 5. Eli stood over the last one, a cold knot tightening in his gut. This was not the work of thirst or heat. This was something else. Hank knelt beside the carcass, his old eyes missing nothing. He leaned down, sniffing at the water's edge. Then at the calf's mouth, he crumbled some of the nearby leaves in his hand. "Loco weed," he said, his voice a low growl. He held out his hand to Eli, showing him the crushed green pulp. "And not just growing, neither. This has been mashed. Someone ground it up and put it in the water, just enough to poison the young ones." Sabotage. The word hung in the oppressive heat of the canyon. It was a poison not just for his cattle, but for his hope. This was a direct attack, a deliberate, cruel blow meant to cripple him. He thought of Dodd's condescending smile, of Pike's cold eyes. This was their work. He had no proof, but he knew it as surely as he knew the ache in his own shoulder. He made a hard decision, leaving Noah to watch the herd. He and Hank rode the long way back to the 3M, pushing their horses hard. He had to know the ranch was safe. He had to face the woman he had brought into this danger. He arrived after dark, exhausted and filled with a cold rage. Mara met him on the porch, a lamp held high. She saw the look on his face, and her expression tightened with concern. She led him into the kitchen and poured him coffee while he told her what had happened, his voice clipped and harsh. When he was done, he looked at her, his face set like stone. "This is not your fight," he said. "Tomorrow, I am taking you back to town. You can stay at the boarding house. I will pay for your room until this is over." She stared at him, her gray eyes searching his. For a long moment, she did not move. Then she picked up her slate. Her hand was perfectly steady as she wrote. She held it up for him to read. The words were simple, an undeniable statement of fact. "I am your wife by law. Where the home is, I am there." He wanted to argue. He wanted to tell her she did not understand, that these men would stop at nothing. He wanted to protect her, to push her away from the ugliness that was coming. But the look in her eyes stopped him. It was not pleading or defiant. It was a look of quiet, unshakable resolve. She had chosen her ground. He had foolishly made her his wife, and she, in her silence, was honoring the vow more seriously than he ever had. He looked at the words on the slate and felt a crack appear in the wall he had built around himself. He was not alone in this fight, whether he wanted to be or not. He gave a short, sharp nod. The argument was over. That night, the dream came again, more vivid than ever. The roar of the guns, the smell of burnt powder, the face of the man he had shot, frozen in a mask of surprise. He woke with a strangled cry, his body drenched in sweat, his heart a wild drum against his ribs. He felt a movement beside him. Mara was there, a shadow in the darkness of his room. She had heard him, as she had the first night. She reached out and placed her hand on him, not on his shoulder this time, but flat against the center of his chest. He could feel the warmth of her palm through the thin material of his shirt, a steady, living heat against his frantic heartbeat. He did not pull away. He lay there, breathing in the dark, focusing on the simple, solid pressure of her hand. The wild drumming in his chest began to slow, the rhythm of his own blood falling into sync with the calm in her touch. The ghosts were still there, lurking in the corners of the room, but their power was diminished. The cold they brought was held at bay by the warmth of her hand. In the quiet space between the nightmare and the dawn, a thought surfaced in his mind, clear and startling. He heard his own voice, a rough whisper in the stillness of the room. "They forced me to marry the silent bride as a joke," he murmured to the darkness, "but your bold touch sets my nights on fire." The word fire did not mean passion. It was not the heat of desire. It was the fire of a hearth in a cold cabin, the fire of a lamp in the dead of night. It was the fire of life itself, a flame that did not consume, but warmed, a flame that pushed back the endless, freezing dark. He drifted back to sleep, a deeper sleep than he had known, with her hand still resting on his chest. The alarm came just before dawn. It was not a sound he had ever heard before, a frantic, clanging peal that cut through the morning quiet. It was the old iron bell on the porch, the one used to call the hands in from the fields. Eli was out of bed in an instant, pulling on his boots, his mind still clouded with sleep. He burst out onto the porch and saw it. Flames were leaping into the sky from behind the main barn. The hayrick, their entire store of dry winter feed, was a raging inferno. Mara was there, on the porch, still pulling on the rope to the bell, her face pale in the flickering orange light. She had been awake. She had saved them. Hank was already running from the bunkhouse with buckets. "The barn!" he yelled, his voice hoarse. "If the roof catches, we lose everything." There was no time to think. They formed a desperate line to the south well, the one that was not yet dry. Eli, Hank, Mara, they passed the heavy, sloshing buckets of water from one to the other. A frantic, losing battle against the roaring beast of the fire. The heat was intense, searing their faces. Smoke billowed, thick and acrid, burning their lungs. Mara worked without a sound, her movements swift and sure, her face grim with determination. She did not falter, even as sparks landed on her dress. They threw bucket after bucket of water onto the barn's shingled roof, onto the walls that were already scorching from the heat. The fire in the hayrick roared. A funeral pyre for their hopes, but the barn, soaked and steaming, held. As the sun rose, the fire died down, leaving a mountain of blackened, smoking ash. They had saved the barn. They had saved the animals inside. They had saved the ranch itself from total destruction. But as he stood there, his body aching, his face black with soot, Eli looked at the smoldering ruins of their winter feed. The fire was out, but the cold reality of their situation was just beginning to settle. They were alive, but they were ruined. The morning after the fire tasted of ash. A gray, greasy soot coated every surface, and the rising sun illuminated not a new day, but the scale of their ruin. The hayrick was a blackened skeleton, a smoldering testament to their lost future. Without that feed, the cattle that had survived the drought so far would not survive the coming weeks. Eli stood with Hank and Noah, the three of them silent before the wreckage. The fight had gone out of him, replaced by a hollow, ringing exhaustion. "Dodd will have buyers circling like buzzards by noon," Hank said, his voice raspy from the smoke. "He knows we are finished. He will offer us 10 cents on the dollar for the herd. And we will have to take it," Eli finished, the words like stones in his throat. To sell now, at a pittance, would mean giving up. It would be handing Phineas Dodd the victory on a silver platter. But the alternative was to stand by and watch his father's legacy, the herd he had worked his whole life to build, starve to death before his eyes. They were trapped. The fire had not just burned their hay, it had burned their last vestiges of hope. While the men stood paralyzed by the impossible choice, Mara moved. She had washed the soot from her face and hands and had put on a clean, mended dress. She went into the house and came back with her small sewing kit and a roll of clean flour sacking. She approached Eli, her face calm, and held up her slate. "I am going to the market." "No," Eli said, his voice harsher than he intended. "The town is a snake pit. They will tear you apart after this." She shook her head, her expression unyielding. She wrote again, her chalk strokes quick and sure. "We need grain. We need seed. I have a skill. Let me use it." He saw the foolishness of it, the indignity, sending his wife, his silent bride, into the heart of the town that mocked them to beg for scraps with a needle and thread. But then he looked into her eyes and saw not desperation, but a fierce, practical resolve. She was not asking for his permission. She was telling him her plan. She was refusing to be a victim of the ashes. An hour later, Noah drove her into Red Mesa in the buckboard. Eli watched them go, a knot of shame and a flicker of something he could not name twisting in his gut. The Saturday market was a swirl of dust, noise, and humanity. Farmers who still had something to sell displayed their meager wares on blankets. Ranchers gathered in tight, worried knots, their talk all of drought and debt. When the 3M buckboard pulled up, a wave of whispers followed its progress. All eyes were on Mara as she climbed down. The women from the church auxiliary turned their shoulders, a silent, unified condemnation. Mara seemed not to notice. She found an empty space between a chicken seller and a man selling dusty, withered apples. She laid out a clean blanket, placed her sewing kit upon it, and then unrolled a large piece of sacking on which she had written in charcoal a clear, bold message. Fair trade, a day's mending for a bag of grain, a week's sowing for a sack of seed. For a long time, no one approached. People would walk by, slow down to read the sign, cast a curious or scornful glance at the silent woman sitting so still and straight-backed, and then hurry on. It was a novel and slightly scandalous sight. Then a woman with a warm, weathered face and intelligent dark eyes stopped directly in front of the blanket. She was Rose Delgado, the owner of the town's mercantile, a woman known for her sharp mind and her refusal to suffer fools. She read the sign, then looked at Mara, her gaze taking in the neat stitches on Mara's own mended dress, the clean, capable look of her hands. "Mrs. Delgado pointed to a torn seam on her canvas apron. Then she pointed to a small bag of pinto beans on a nearby farmer's stall. She raised her eyebrows in a silent question. Mara nodded. She took the apron, threaded a needle with a speed that was mesmerizing, and began to work. Her stitches were tiny, even, and strong. In minutes, the torn seam was gone, replaced by a line of mending so neat it was nearly invisible. She handed the apron back. Rose Delgado inspected the work, a slow, appreciative smile spreading across her face. She walked over to the farmer, paid for the bag of beans, and placed it on Mara's blanket. "Gracias," she said, her voice clear and carrying. "Good work is good work." That single act of validation broke the spell. An older rancher, his face a mask of worry, brought her a pair of canvas trousers with a ripped knee. A young mother shyly offered a child's dress in exchange for a handful of vegetable seeds. All afternoon, a small but steady stream of people came to her blanket. They were the ones on the margins, the ones as beaten down by the drought as the McKennas, people for whom a fair trade was a godsend. Mara worked without stopping, her needle a silent, flashing shuttle weaving a new kind of currency from thread and skill. That night, Noah grew restless. The day's small victory at the market felt fragile against the weight of their larger problems. Something was gnawing at him, a suspicion that had taken root since the discovery of the poisoned calves. He slipped out of the bunkhouse, his boots making no sound in the deep dust. He was not sure what he was looking for, but he felt a pull toward the North Spring, the source of all their troubles. The moon was a sliver, casting long, distorted shadows across the land. As he neared the trickle of water, he heard a faint sound, a soft scraping, He dropped to a crouch behind a cluster of mesquite, his heart starting to pound. A figure was kneeling at the edge of the spring. In the dim light, Noah recognized the man's broad shoulders and the slouch of his hat. It was Jasper Crow. He was holding a small cloth bag and was carefully, methodically, shaking a fine powder into the shallow pool of water. A blind rage seized Noah. He burst from his hiding place, shouting, "Crow, get away from there!" Jasper scrambled to his feet, his face a pale mask of shock in the moonlight. He dropped the bag and bolted, running with the surprising speed of a cornered animal. Noah gave chase, his younger legs eating up the ground. But Crow had a horse tethered nearby. He threw himself into the saddle and galloped away, disappearing into the darkness. Noah stood panting, his fury turning to a cold triumph. He went back to the spring. The cloth bag lay on the muddy bank. He picked it up carefully. It had a strange, bitter smell. The same smell Hank had identified on the dead calves. Tucked into the drawstring was a folded piece of paper. Noah's hands trembled as he opened it. It was a hastily scrawled note. The message was short: midnight, SP. Eli rode into Red Mesa the next morning with a purpose as hard and cold as the piece of rock in his pocket. He did not go to the sheriff, who was a known friend of Phineas Dodd. He went straight to the church. He found Reverend Pike arranging hymn books on a lectern, the morning light from the tall windows making a halo of the dust motes dancing around his head. "Reverend," Eli said, his voice flat. Pike looked up, his expression one of measured piety. "Mr. McKenna, it is a rare thing to see you in the house of the Lord." Eli walked down the aisle and stopped before him. He placed the cloth bag and the note on the polished wood of the lectern. "Your man was busy last night, poisoning what is left of my water." Pike looked at the evidence without touching it. His face registered a practiced, thoughtful concern. "My man, I do not understand. That is Jasper Crow's writing. Is it not he is Mr. Dodd's employee?" "Your initials are on the note," Eli said, his voice dangerously quiet. "SP Silas Pike." The Reverend actually laughed, a short, dry sound of pity. "My dear boy, S.P. could stand for anything. Saltpeter, saddle polish. It is hardly a confession. You are overwrought. This tragedy with your ranch has unhinged you." "Crow was poisoning my cattle. Pike." "Or perhaps," Pike said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "you have brought a curse upon yourself. This town has been a good, God-fearing place. But since you brought that woman to your home, a shadow has fallen. A silent woman. A strange woman. Who knows what dark arts she practices? Perhaps she is the one who has bewitched your animals, soured your water, and clouded your mind with these paranoid fantasies." The door at the back of the church opened, and Phineas Dodd stepped inside, looking for all the world as if he were merely dropping by for a moment of quiet reflection. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice smooth as oil, "I hope I am not interrupting." He walked toward them, his eyes taking in the bag and the note. "What is this, Eli? You look terrible. Is everything all right?" "He is accusing the Reverend of a terrible crime," Pike said, his voice filled with the pain of a deeply wronged man. "He claims I am in league with your Mr. Crow to destroy his ranch." Dodd looked from Eli's furious face to Pike's mask of sorrow. He shook his head slowly. "Eli, my friend, you must calm yourself. Reverend Pike is a pillar of this community. To suggest such a thing is, well, it is unthinkable. I am truly sorry for your troubles, but you cannot go around making these wild accusations." It was a perfect performance. The three of them, a closed circle of conspiracy, and he was the madman on the outside. Eli snatched the bag and the note from the lectern and turned, his boots echoing in the empty church as he walked out into the unforgiving sunlight. The world seemed determined to grind them into the dust. A few days later, the sky turned a bruised yellow. The wind picked up, howling across the plains, and a massive dust devil, a swirling vortex of red earth and debris, tore across the north pasture. When it was over, they found 3 more dead calves, their small, weak bodies simply unable to endure the storm. As if that were not enough, a new terror followed. A low rumble grew into a thundering that shook the very ground. A small, breakaway herd of buffalo, driven mad with thirst and displaced from their usual territory, stampeded directly through the ranch yard. They pounded through the small garden Mara had painstakingly planted with the seeds she had earned, their heavy hooves churning the tender green shoots into the dirt. The devastation was complete. Mara stood looking at the wreckage of her hard work. Her shoulders slumped, but only for a moment. A fire rekindled in her eyes. She ran to the barn, emerging with 2 long sticks and a roll of red flannel from her sewing supplies. She tore the flannel into strips and tied them to the sticks, creating 2 bright flags. She handed one to Noah. She found an old tin whistle in a toolbox and put it to her lips. Together, they ran toward the retreating herd. Mara blew on the whistle, a shrill, piercing sound, while they waved the red flags. The led buffalo, confused by the strange noise and the flashing color, turned, and the rest of the herd followed, thundering off into the distance. That evening, in his office, Judge Caffrey stared at a law book, his fingers tracing the dense text of the territorial marriage statutes. The bottle of whiskey on his desk remained unopened. He kept seeing the scene in the saloon, hearing the roar of the crowd, feeling the heavy thud of the official seal in his hand. It had been a joke. But the law, he was beginning to realize with a sickening dread, did not have a sense of humor. The document was signed, witnessed, and sealed. It was legal, and he was the one who had made it so. When Eli came in from his final check on the animals, he found a piece of paper slipped beneath the front door. There was no name, no signature. The handwriting was rough, disguised. The message was brief. "Get rid of her, and I will save your land." He read the words twice. It was an offer from one of his enemies, a chance to save himself by sacrificing her. He looked through the open kitchen door. Mara was at the table, a single lamp burning, carefully trying to salvage some of the bruised seedlings from her ruined garden. Her head was bent in concentration, her hands gentle and precise. Without a second thought, Eli tore the note into small, unrecognizable pieces. He let them flutter from his fingers onto the dusty floorboards. The choice had been made long ago, in the dark of his room, when a silent touch had set his nights on fire. The Red Mesa Harvest Festival was a stubborn act of faith in a faithless year. The usual bounty was absent. The tables displayed not mountains of squash and corn, but collections of gnarled roots and preserves from seasons past. Still, the town gathered. It was a reason to come together, to pretend for a day that the dust was not winning. There were horse races on the main street, a shooting competition with a prize ham, and, most importantly, an auction for a small, precious stack of hay baled from a river bottom far to the south. Reverend Pike stood on a platform near the auction block, his voice ringing out over the crowd. He was not speaking of harvests, but of plagues. He spoke of a spiritual drought that mirrored the one on the land, of wickedness taking root in the community, of the need for a great and cleansing fire to purify their souls. His eyes, burning with a righteous zeal, swept over the crowd and settled for a long, pointed moment on Eli and Mara as they made their way through the throng. Eli felt the weight of those stares, the whispers that followed them like a trail of snakes. Mara walked beside him, her head held high, her gaze fixed forward. She had insisted they come. "We are part of this town." Her slate had said, "We will not hide." The whispers intensified, taking on a new, excited edge. The rumor had started, as most did. In the mesquite rose, Judge Caffrey, his resolve to stay sober having crumbled under the weight of his guilt, had been holding court at the bar, in a fit of maudlin, drunken confession. He had told anyone who would listen that his hand had been guided by a $5 gold piece the night of the joke auction. He had been paid. He slurred, paid to make it all look real. The news was a spark in the dry tinder of the town's gossip. It was not a real marriage. It was a sham. A drunken prank with a paid-off official. It could be undone. The whole sorry spectacle could be erased. And Eli McKenna, the proud rancher, would be left with nothing but his shame. The crowd was gleeful, savoring the drama, hungry for the public humiliation they felt was coming. Eli felt the atmosphere shift from hostile to something worse, mocking pity. Men who had once looked at him with respect now gave him smirking glances. He wanted to leave, to take Mara away from this public dissection of their lives. They were near the large warehouse where the merchants stored their goods for the market. Suddenly, a deafening bang split the air, followed by a whistling shriek and a shower of colorful sparks. Some of the town boys, eager for the evening's festivities, had set off one of the fireworks. The sound hit Eli like a physical blow. It was not a firework. It was the flat, deadly crack of a Colt .44 in a small, enclosed room. The smell was not sulfur, but burnt gunpowder. The cheering of the crowd was the yell of a dying man. The world tilted, the colors of the festival bleeding into a hazy, terrifying red. He was back in that hotel room in Prescott. The table overturned, the other man's eyes wide with a surprise that was turning to black emptiness. His breath seized in his chest. His heart was a wild animal trying to claw its way out of his ribs. The scar on his shoulder burned with a phantom fire. He staggered back, his hand instinctively going to his hip for a gun that was not there. The sounds of the festival became a roaring in his ears, meaningless and terrifying. He was drowning. Then, a touch. It was not startling. It was firm, deliberate, and utterly calm. Mara was beside him. Her hand was on his left shoulder, directly over the scar, a point of anchor in the spinning chaos of his mind. She did not speak, did not ask what was wrong. She knew. Her eyes met his, and in their gray depths he saw not fear or pity, but an astonishing strength. She held his gaze, refusing to let him look away, refusing to let him sink back into the nightmare. Her other hand took his, her fingers lacing through his own. Her grip was strong, a lifeline. She pulled him gently, leading him away from the noise and the staring faces, into the cool, dark quiet of the open warehouse. She guided him into a corner, behind a stack of barrels that smelled of pickles and molasses. The roaring in his ears began to subside, replaced by the scent of sawdust and the deep, comforting shadows. She stood before him, still holding his hand, her other hand still resting on his shoulder. She was facing his terror with him, standing between him and the ghosts. Her touch was not soft or hesitant. It was bold. It was the touch of someone unafraid of his broken places. She held his eyes, and he saw her chest rise and fall in a slow, even rhythm. She wanted him to breathe with her. Inhale. Exhale. He watched her, focused on her, and forced the air into his own burning lungs. In. Out. The wild animal in his chest began to quiet. The red haze behind his eyes began to clear. He stood there for a long time, in the quiet dark of the warehouse, his hand held by a silent woman, and slowly, piece by piece, he came back to himself. That night, back at the 3M, the wind was quiet. The moon cast a gentle, silver light over the land. For the first time, Eli did not dread the coming of the dark. He lay in his bed, the ghosts of the past finally silent, held at bay by a new and powerful memory. He thought of her courage, the way she had walked into his panic and let him out. He heard his own voice, a whisper in the quiet room. The words no longer a confused murmur, but a statement of profound truth. "They forced me to marry the silent bride as a joke," he said, "but your bold touch set my nights on fire." He understood it now. The fire was not the destructive blaze of a nightmare. It was the steady, warm flame of hope. It was the light of a single candle that proves the darkness is not absolute. The next morning, Eli rose with a new purpose. He did not consult Hank or Noah. He did not ask for Mara's opinion. He knew what he had to do. He went to the barn and found a solid, smooth plank of pine. He spent the morning in the workshop, the scrape of his plane and the rhythmic knock of his mallet the only sounds. He worked carefully, carving letters deep into the wood, his hands steady, his purpose clear. When he was done, he carried the finished sign to the front gate of the ranch, the gate that opened onto the main road to town. He dug 2 post holes and set the sign himself, making sure it was straight and true. He stepped back to look at his work. The letters were dark and deep, a permanent declaration for all to see. Mara Quinn McKenna, mistress of 3M. He was no longer hiding. He was no longer ashamed. He had made his choice. He had claimed his wife. He had claimed their life together. In the face of the town, in the face of his enemies, in the face of the whole damn dusty world. The response came the following night. It came not as a whisper or a threat, but as a roar. Eli was jolted from a deep, peaceful sleep by the sound of a tremendous explosion that shook the very foundations of the house. He was on his feet in an instant, the old panic a distant echo, replaced by a cold, immediate fury. He ran outside and saw the flames. They were not at the hayrick this time. They were coming from the main stable, where they kept the riding horses. The large stable door had been blown off its hinges and lay splintered on the ground. Hank was already there, pulling the terrified, whinnying horses out of the smoke-filled building. Eli ran to help, his mind racing. This was not an accident. This was gunpowder. He heard a cry of pain from the side of the stable. He found Noah on the ground, his face pale, clutching his arm. A piece of flying debris from the blast had struck him. The wound was bloody, but not deep. As Eli knelt beside the boy, Hank shouted from the darkness, "Got one!" Eli looked up. Hank had a man pinned against the corral fence, one arm twisted behind his back. The man was whimpering, his face a mask of terror in the firelight. Eli recognized him. It was Earl Timmons, a feckless, shifty-eyed man who did odd jobs around town, mostly for the church. Eli walked over to him, his face a grim mask. "Why, Earl," he asked, his voice low and dangerous. Timmons started to blubber, his eyes darting around wildly. "He made me do it. It was not my idea." "Who made you do it?" Eli demanded, his voice like the scrape of steel on stone. Timmons hesitated. Then a fresh wave of fear washed over him. "Crow," he sobbed. "Jasper Crow? He paid me. He said it would just be a little fire, just a scare. He never said nothing about no gunpowder." The confession of Earl Timmons hung in the firelit air, a sordid and pathetic truth. But before Eli could act on it, nature unleashed a fury that dwarfed their own. For the first time in a year, the sky broke. It did not begin with a gentle promise, but with a sudden, violent assault. Thick, bruised clouds rolled in from the east, and the wind, which for months had only carried dust, now carried the cold, wet scent of rain. The first drops were as big as coins, splattering in the dust, leaving dark, hungry circles. Then the circles merged, and the sky opened. It was not a life-giving shower, but a deluge, a solid wall of water that hit the baked earth and turned it to a slick, running sea of red mud. Thunder cracked overhead, a celestial artillery barrage, and lightning lit the plains in stark, blue-white flashes. The dry creek bed that snaked past the ranch, a dusty memory of water for as long as anyone could remember, was reborn in minutes. A low rumble grew to a roar as a flash flood. A 10-foot wall of churning brown water, logs, and debris tore down the canyon. It ripped out fence posts, swallowed scrub brush, and slammed against the small wooden diversion dam his father had built years ago to channel water in wetter times. The flood was a terror, but it was also a cleansing. The next morning, under a washed, impossibly blue sky, the world was remade, The air was clean, the dust was gone, and the land was a patchwork of deep puddles and thick, red mud. The creek was still a torrent, but it was receding, and there, snagged on the splintered timbers of the broken dam, was a small, sodden cloth bag. Noah saw it first. It was the bag Jasper Crow had dropped, miraculously recovered from the flood's churning chaos. But it was more than that now. The relentless scouring of the water had washed away the mud, revealing a small, stamped insignia on the canvas, a mortar and pestle circled by the words Prescott Agricultural Apothecary. It was the final piece. Eli held the bag, the damning proof, in his hand. News of the explosion and the capture of Timmons traveled as fast as the floodwaters. It was the breaking of a dam of fear in Red Mesa. That afternoon, a small, determined procession made its way up the muddy track to the 3M. Rose Delgado came, her face set with grim purpose. She was followed by Dr. Avery, the town's physician, a man of science who had long been troubled by the number of unfortunate accidents among the smaller ranches. With them was Deputy Lane, a young lawman who had chafed under the thumb of the town's corrupt leadership, his holster now worn with a new sense of authority. And behind them were two other ranchers, men who had lost livestock to mysterious illnesses and seen their wells inexplicably fail, men who had been too scared to speak up alone. They gathered in Eli's kitchen, the smell of fresh coffee a welcome comfort against the gravity of the moment. One by one, they told their stories. Dr. Avery confirmed the apothecary mark on the bag. He knew the supplier. A man who sold potent agricultural toxins with few questions asked. A man Reverend Pike had been known to correspond with regarding blights and pest control. Mrs. Delgado spoke of the unusual lines of credit Dodd had extended to Pike, and the way the banker had systematically squeezed every rancher whose land bordered the dry northern water route. The other ranchers spoke of Jasper Crow, who always seemed to be nearby just before disaster struck. Each story was a thread, and together they wove a tapestry of greed, corruption, and calculated cruelty. They had Timmons's confession, Noah's testimony, and now, the poison itself, linked directly to Pike's network. They finally had enough. The hearing was not a formal trial, but a preliminary examination held by Judge Caffrey in the town courthouse. The room was packed, the air thick with humidity and anticipation. The entire town was there, drawn by the promise of a final, public unraveling. Eli, Mara, Hank, and their small band of allies sat on one side, on the other, looking composed and untouchable. Sat Phineas Dodd and Reverend Pike. Jasper Crow, his hands bound, stood between two of Deputy Lane's men, his usual swagger gone, replaced by a sullen, hunted look. Judge Caffrey, sober and pale, his hands trembling slightly, called the room to order. He looked a decade older than he had at the festival. Deputy Lane presented the case first, his voice clear and steady. He had Earl Timmons brought forward. The hired man, shaking like a leaf, repeated his confession, stammering that Reverend Pike had hired him through Jasper Crow, telling him it was God's work to drive the evil influence of the silent woman from the land. Pike rose to his feet, his face a mask of wounded piety. A lie, from the mouth of a known degenerate. This is a conspiracy, a persecution led by a man whose mind has been poisoned by a woman who will not even speak her own name. Then, Judge Caffrey did something no one expected. He held up a hand to silence the Reverend. "There has been enough poison in this town. Silas," he said, his voice heavy with regret. He turned to the crowded room. "I have a confession of my own to make. The marriage of Eli McKenna and Mara Quinn. The document was legal. The seal was real, but my judgment that night was not. I was paid $5 by Mr. Crow here to perform the ceremony and to treat it as a joke." He took a deep, shuddering breath. "I accepted a bribe. I failed my office, and I failed this community." A collective gasp went through the room. The foundation of the town's mockery had crumbled. The joke was not a joke. It was a legal, binding marriage, presided over by a corrupt judge. Dodd looked momentarily surprised. Then his smooth composure returned. A sad and unfortunate lapse. Judge. But it has no bearing on the financial realities of Mr. McKenna's situation, nor on these wild, unsubstantiated accusations against a man of God. It seemed they might wriggle free, that they could dismiss it all as the ramblings of a drunk and a coward. But then the doors at the back of the courthouse swung open. A woman stood there, dressed in a simple gray dress, her face pale but resolute. It was Mildred Dodd, the banker's quiet, overlooked wife. For years she had been a shadow in her husband's life, a silent witness to his ambition. Now, the shadow had found a voice. She walked down the central aisle, clutching a large leather-bound ledger to her chest. Phineas Dodd's face went white. "Mildred!" he hissed. "What is the meaning of this go home?" She did not even look at him. She walked directly to the judge's bench and placed the heavy book upon it. "I will not live in a house built on the ruins of other people's lives any longer." "Phineas," she said, her voice quiet, but carrying to every corner of the silent room. "This is my husband's private ledger. You will find it is also a map." Judge Caffrey opened the book. The pages were filled with Dodd's neat, precise script, detailing loans and foreclosures. But tucked into the back was a hand-drawn map of San Miguel County. On it, a blue line had been drawn, tracing a path directly through the northern pastures of the 3M and several of the other small ranches, whose owners now sat beside Eli. It was labeled Subterranean Aquifer. Beside it was a list of properties, each with a valuation far exceeding its current worth. And at the bottom of the page was a partnership agreement, a contract allocating a 40% share of all future profits from water rights to a silent partner, Reverend Silas Pike. The room erupted. The carefully constructed worlds of Phineas Dodd and Silas Pike shattered in an instant. Pike, his face contorted in a mask of fury, saw his last chance. He leaped onto the witness stand, raising his hands as if delivering a sermon. "Fools! You are all fools, blinded by sin. This is not about land or water. This is a test of your faith. The drought, the fires, the poison. It is all a sign of the Lord's displeasure. He has sent this trial upon you because of her." He pointed a trembling finger at Mara, the silent bride, a vessel of darkness sent to tempt and destroy. She does not speak because the devil has her tongue. She has ensnared this man. She has divided this town. Cast her out, purge this evil from among you, and the rains will return. The land will heal. It is God's will. His voice was a hypnotic, fanatical roar. He was trying to turn a legal hearing into a witch trial. Some in the crowd, those most loyal to him, began to murmur their agreement, their faces turning from curiosity to a dark, fearful suspicion. Eli started to rise, a hot denial on his lips. But Mara put a hand on his arm, stopping him. She stood up, slowly, and faced the room. She did not look at Pike. She looked at the faces of the townspeople, the men and women she had traded with, the children she had taught. The room fell silent, waiting. What could she do? What could she say? She said nothing. She simply raised her right hand, palm forward, in a simple, clean gesture. A sign to stop, a sign that said, plainly and powerfully, "Enough." For a moment, nothing happened. Then, at the back of the room, a small hand went up, mimicking hers. It was the little girl from the market, then another child, and another. The children she had shown the sign for hello, the ones who had learned that silence was not emptiness. They all raised their hands. Their parents looked on, their own anger and fear abating as they watched the simple, brave act of their children. The quiet gesture of defiance spread through the room, a silent chorus that was louder than all of Pike's raging. The fanaticism in Pike's eyes guttered out, replaced by the hollow look of defeat. The silence in the room was absolute, a final judgment on his hatred and his lies. Judge Caffrey found his voice. He banged his gavel. the sound cracking through the stillness. "Reverend Pike, Jasper Crow, you are under arrest. To be held for the Territorial Circuit Judge. Mr. Dodd, you are suspended from all duties at the bank. Pending a full investigation, Deputy Lane will assume temporary control of all assets." He looked down at Eli and Mara, his expression one of deep and profound remorse. "The marriage contract is legal and binding. It cannot be annulled on the basis of its origin. However," he added, his voice softening, "the law also recognizes the right of an individual to be free from a contract entered into under duress. Mrs. McKenna, you are within your rights to petition for an annulment, and given the circumstances, I would grant it without hesitation." All eyes turned to Mara. She was free. The joke was over, and she could walk away, leaving this town and this man behind her forever. She picked up her slate. She wrote 3 words, her hand steady, the chalk making a soft, scratching sound in the quiet room. She held it up for the judge, for Eli, for the whole town to see. "I choose to stay." The verdict in the courthouse did not just condemn 2 men. It broke the fever that had held San Miguel County in its grip. The truth, once spoken aloud, was like the flash flood, a force that scoured away the accumulated filth of fear and suspicion, leaving behind a raw and altered landscape. The change was not immediate, but it was undeniable. It began the very next day. A wagon, its wheels still caked in red mud, creaked up the lane to the 3M. It was driven by Tom Ewell, a rancher from the South Slope whose property bordered Eli's. He was a man with whom Eli had shared little more than curt nods for 5 years. Ewell pulled his team to a halt and looked at the new sign by the gate, then at the charred remains of the stable. He did not get down from the wagon. "McKenna," he called out, his voice rough but clear of its usual edge. Eli came out onto the porch. Mara, a quiet presence behind him in the doorway. "Heard you lost your feed," Ewell said, gesturing with his thumb toward the back of his wagon. It was loaded with bales of hay. "It is not much, but my herd is small this year. I can spare it." Eli stood motionless, the simple generosity of the offer striking him with more force than any of Pike's condemnations. This was how a community was supposed to work, not with judgment and suspicion, but with a shared understanding of the thin line they all walked between survival and ruin. "I cannot pay you for it, Tom," Eli said, the admission costing him a piece of his stubborn pride. "Did not ask for payment," Ewell grunted. He began to unhitch his wagon. "Just tell me where you want it." He was the first, but he was not the last. Throughout the week, other ranchers came, one with a wagon of feed, another with a promise of help to rebuild the stable, another still offering to pool their resources to bring water up from the lower river until the spring could be properly cleared. They were men Eli had known his whole life, men who had been swayed by Pike's poison and intimidated by Dodd's power. Now, with the truth laid bare, they were returning, not with apologies, but with the quiet, practical atonement of work. The most surprising visitors arrived a week after the hearing. A buggy carrying 3 women from the Red Mesa Ladies' Aid Society pulled up to the house. They were the same women who had turned their backs on Mara in the market, their faces now a mixture of embarrassment and stiff resolve. Their leader, the blacksmith's wife, clutched a Bible in her hands like a shield. Mara met them at the door. The women stood on the porch, avoiding her eyes, a study in awkward duty. "Mrs. McKenna," the blacksmith's wife began, the name sounding strange and formal on her lips. The society has been discussing matters with the Reverend gone. We feel a certain responsibility." She took a breath and forced herself to meet Mara's calm gaze. "Old Mrs. Hemlock, her hearing is almost gone. And little Timothy Miller, born without the ability to hear a sound. We see the way the children have taken to your hand signals. We were wondering if you would be willing to teach us just a few basic things, so we might better serve the needy in our community." It was a peace offering, wrapped in the stiff paper of Christian duty. But it was an offering nonetheless. They were not just accepting her, they were asking for her help. They were acknowledging that her silence, the very thing they had feared and mocked, was a language they now needed to learn. Mara smiled, a warm, genuine expression that seemed to light her face from within. She nodded and gestured for them to come inside. Watching from the barn where he was mending harnesses, Eli felt a profound shift within himself. The ranch was coming back to life, not just through his own efforts, but through the actions of others, through the quiet strength of the woman who was his wife. His own silence, he realized, was not like hers. Hers was a prison she had turned into a fortress. His had been a prison of his own making, built of pride and pain. He saw Noah sorting lumber for the new stable walls, his arm now wrapped in a clean bandage. The boy still moved with a slight stiffness. Eli walked over to him, the words he needed to say feeling heavy and unfamiliar in his throat. "Noah," he said. The boy looked up, his expression open and questioning. "That night, at the stable, you getting hurt, that was my fault." Noah's eyes widened. "No, Eli, it was Crow. It was Timmons." "It was my fight," Eli insisted, forcing himself to speak the truth. "I brought it here. I brought the danger to this ranch. And you got caught in it. I should have kept you safe. I am sorry." The apology, so simple and so long overdue, hung in the air between them. Noah looked down at the ground, then back up at Eli, a slow smile spreading across his face. "We are all in this fight. Eli, we are all 3M. Eli nodded, a weight he had not even realized he was carrying lifting from his shoulders. Later that day, he found Hank by the corral, inspecting a horse's hoof. "Hank," he said, "I have been thinking. When the papers are all settled with the bank, I am changing things." The old man grunted, not looking up from his work. "About time. I want you to be a partner," Eli said, the words coming more easily this time. "Not a foreman, a full partner. 20% of the profits. You have earned it 10 times over." Hank finally straightened up, his back cracking. He looked at Eli, his dark eyes sharp and appraising. He had seen Eli grow from a boy into a man, had seen him harden after the shooting, and now was seeing him change again. A man does not work his whole life for wages. "Eli," he said slowly, "he works for a piece of something. To leave his mark, you are doing the right thing. Your PA would be proud." He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Now let us get back to work. This place is not going to rebuild itself." While the ranch healed under the sun, a different kind of healing was taking place in the quiet moments of the day. Dr. Avery began making regular visits, not as a physician, but as a friend. He would sit with Mara in the newly rebuilt grain storehouse, the air smelling of fresh-cut pine and promise. He brought with him books on phonetics and diagrams of the human throat. He learned from her, through her writing, the story of what had happened to her family, the violent terror that had stolen her voice, not through physical injury, but through a trauma so profound it had severed the connection between her mind and her tongue. "The instrument is not broken, Mara," he told her one afternoon, his voice gentle. "It is just asleep. We have to teach it to wake up again." He taught her breathing exercises, how to shape her mouth to form vowels. For days, the only result was a soft, breathy hiss. She would grow frustrated, her hands clenching, but she never gave up. She would look at Eli as he worked, her expression filled with a fierce determination. Then, one evening, she did it. She was trying to make the sound of his name. She had written it on her slate, Ely, and was tracing the letters with her finger, her lips moving silently. Dr. Avery encouraged her, just the first part, Mara, a long E sound, like in C or B. She took a deep, shuddering breath, her eyes closed in concentration. A sound came from her throat, a rough, scratchy, unfamiliar noise. It was more a croak than a word, but it was a sound she had made. Her eyes flew open, wide with a mixture of shock and triumph. Eli, who had been standing in the doorway, moved into the room. He knelt in front of her, his expression one of rapt attention. "Try again," he said softly. She looked at him, at his face, so close to hers. She took another breath, and this time, the sound was clearer, more formed. It was a raw, rasping thing, a sound torn from a place of deep silence. She whispered, her hand flying to her own throat as if to feel the impossible vibration. Lee. His name. Her first word after years of silence was his name. He reached out and took her hand, his thumb stroking the back of her knuckles. He did not need to speak. The look in his eyes said everything. The wheels of justice, once they finally began to turn, moved with a surprising speed. The territorial prosecutor, a stern, no-nonsense man from Prescott, arrived and took over the case, faced with the mountain of evidence and the testimony of his own wife. Phineas Dodd offered no defense. He was taken away in chains, destined for a long trial and a longer sentence for fraud and conspiracy. Reverend Pike, ever the pragmatist, struck a deal. He pleaded guilty to lesser charges of inciting public unrest and being an accessory to property damage, all while maintaining that his actions were born of a misguided but sincere moral fervor. His confession saved him from the more serious charges of conspiracy to commit murder. But his life in Red Mesa was over. He was escorted from the town, a fallen prophet leaving behind a congregation that was just beginning to find its own way. With the human poison removed, it was as if the land itself could finally breathe again. The North Spring, scoured clean by the flood, began to run clear and strong. The trickle became a steady, bubbling flow. When Eli and Hank went up to inspect it, they found something the flood had uncovered. The water was not just seeping from the rocks, it was pushing up from a deep fissure in the bedrock, a place where the water table was so close to the surface you could feel its cool promise in the air. "Your PA always said there was a real vein of water up here somewhere," Hank said, his voice filled with a quiet awe. He always dreamed of digging a proper stone-lined well, one that would never run dry. Eli looked at the clear, life-giving water, then out at the greening pastures of the 3M. It was more than a dream now. It was a promise, a foundation on which to build a future. The rains gave way to a long, gentle autumn that painted the creekside cottonwoods in strokes of brilliant gold. The land, having drunk its fill, seemed to sigh in contentment. The red dust was gone, replaced by the green fuzz of new grass that grew with a stubborn, tender tenacity. The change in the land was mirrored by the change in the town of Red Mesa, which was quietly, painstakingly, rebuilding its own soul from the ashes of deceit. The heart of this new Red Mesa was not the silent, shuttered church, but a long room at the back of Rose Delgado's mercantile. It was a space that smelled of chalk dust, bolts of calico, and brewing coffee. By day, it was a schoolhouse. By night, a sewing circle. Mrs. Delgado, with her sharp mind and generous spirit, had become the town's unofficial mayor, judge, and conscience all rolled into one, and at her side, as a quiet but essential partner, was Mara. She had become the town's teacher of 2 languages. For the children, she taught letters and numbers, her chalk moving in elegant, clean lines across a large slate blackboard. She had a patient, gentle way, and the children adored her. But she also taught a second language, the one she had carried in her hands. 2 old misses, hemlock. She taught the signs for good morning and cup of tea, bringing a light of connection back into the woman's faded, lonely eyes. To the Miller boy, she opened up the entire world, giving him words for son, horse, mother, and friend, his hands flying as he finally found a way to let the thoughts out of his head. One afternoon, Eli brought a newly carved and painted sign to the school. He had made it himself from the same pine as the one at his gate. He mounted it over the doorway for all to see. It read, in simple, clear letters. Those without a voice still have a word. The motto was more than a statement. It was the town's new creed, a testament to the idea that every soul had something of value to say, even if they said it with a needle and thread, a shared bale of hay, or the silent language of the hands. The 3M ranch was transformed. The new stable, built with the help of their neighbors, smelled of fresh pine and clean straw. A series of irrigation ditches, dug along the lines of his father's old plans, now carried the steady flow from the new well out to the pastures, turning them a deep, hopeful green. In the fields, a herd of autumn calves, fat and healthy, kicked up their heels in the cool morning air. The brand of the 3M was no longer a mark of impending failure, but a symbol of resilience. One crisp October afternoon, Eli found Noah by the new well, drawing a bucket of clear, cold water. The boy had grown in the past months, his shoulders broadening, the last of his boyish uncertainty replaced by a quiet, capable confidence. Eli held out a folded piece of paper. "This is for you," Eli said. Noah took it, his brow furrowed in confusion. He unfolded it. It was a legal deed, drawn up by a lawyer in Prescott and filed with the Territorial Land Office. It granted him title to a 20-acre plot of his own, the parcel of land right next to the new well, the best watered piece of land on the entire ranch. Noah looked up, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Eli, I cannot take this." "You have already earned it," Eli said, his voice firm. "A man needs a place to build his own future. This is your start. You are not a hired hand anymore. Noah, you are a neighbor." The boy swallowed hard, a film of moisture shining in his eyes. He did not say thank you. He did not need to. He just folded the deed carefully, a look of profound, life-altering gratitude on his face, and offered his hand to Eli. They shook, no longer as boss and hand, but as equals, as men of the West who had faced the fire together and had come out stronger on the other side. The legal proceedings in Prescott had finally drawn to a close. The letters from the lawyers had stopped coming. The shadow of the past, of the debt and the deception, was finally and truly gone. The land was secure. The future was their own to make. That evening, as the sun began its slow descent, casting long, peaceful shadows, Eli found Mara by the creek. She was standing beneath a tall, old cypress tree that grew at the water's edge. Its roots sunk deep into the newly softened earth. The sound of the running water was a constant, gentle music. He came and stood beside her. For a long time, they just watched the water, a comfortable silence between them. This was their place, their sanctuary. "Mara," he said, his voice quiet. He had practiced the words in his head, but they still felt clumsy, inadequate for the weight of what he wanted to say. He turned to face her. That night in the saloon, it was a joke, a cruel, ugly joke. It was not real. She looked at him, her gray eyes searching his, waiting. "They put my name on a piece of paper," he continued, his voice growing stronger. "Surer, they tied me to you with a lie, but my heart has tied itself to you with the truth. The truth is, I cannot imagine this ranch, this life, without you. You are the mistress of the 3M, and that sign is the truest thing I have ever written. But I need you to be my wife, not by law, not by a drunken judge's seal, but by choice. Your choice, and mine." He reached into his pocket and pulled out not a ring, but a single, smooth, white stone he had found by the creek. A perfect blank slate. He held it out to her on the palm of his hand. "Mara Quinn," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "Will you marry me?" A slow, brilliant smile spread across her face. It was a smile of pure, unshadowed joy. She took the stone from his hand. She did not need her slate. She reached down, picked up a piece of sharp granite, and carefully, lovingly, scratched 2 words onto the surface of the smooth white stone. She held it up for him to see. Yes, always? Tears welled in his eyes, hot and surprising. He had not cried in 20 years. He pulled her to him, his arms wrapping around her, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. Which she was. She pulled back just enough to look at him, her eyes sparkling. She took the sharp rock again and added 3 more words to the stone, a flash of her old, resilient humor shining through. She showed it to him. This time, no joke. He laughed, a real, deep, free laugh that seemed to come from the very center of his soul. He kissed her then, a long, slow, gentle kiss under the shade of the old cypress, with the sound of the life-giving water as their witness. It was a new beginning, freely chosen, built not on a foundation of dust and lies, but on the solid ground of respect, courage, and a love that had learned to speak without words. That night, the wind whispered through the newly leafed trees, a sound of peace, not menace. Eli lay in the quiet dark of their room, the weight of the day and the promise of the future settling over him like a warm blanket. He was no longer a man haunted by ghosts. The nightmares were gone, chased away by the steady presence of the woman beside him. As if sensing his thoughts, Mara moved, her hand coming to rest on his chest, a familiar, comforting weight over his heart. It was their nightly ritual, a silent sacrament of peace and belonging. The fire she had lit in him was no longer the sharp, startling flame of survival, but the deep, enduring glow of a hearth fire, a beacon of home and life. He closed his eyes, a profound sense of gratitude washing over him. They forced me to marry the silent bride for a laugh, he thought, his hand covering hers. But it was her courageous touch that lit the quiet nights. The West was still a hard place, a land of unforgiving sun and sudden storms, but they were no longer alone, no longer adrift. They had found their anchor in each other. They had learned the deepest truth of the frontier home is not the place you are given. It is the place you choose to build. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And remember to subscribe to our channel Wild West Night. Like the video. And support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.